Hey guys, it's Ernesto. Welcome back to another Monday Critique. I hope you guys are having a fantastic Monday. I'm having a great Monday. Today we have two fantastic images to critique, and I can't wait to get into those two images. Guys, I gotta tell you, one of these images really had me speechless. I think it's the first time. But then they say it's the first time for everything, right? And today is that day. I'll see you guys after the intro. If you guys want to submit your image to be critiqued, please join our Facebook group. It's called Fine Art Photography and Modeling. In that group, I created a specific thread where you could submit your images to be critiqued. All right, guys, welcome back. So let's jump straight into the first image, which was submitted by this gentleman, Martinez. Thank you very much for submitting your image. Now, I did mention at the intro that there was one particular image that left me speechless. Now, the image that left me speechless was Martinez's image. Not the entire image, just one particular area in the image. And that is the very first area that we always start with when we're critiquing these images, and that is lighting. Now, when I was viewing this image, I would say maybe it's attributed to the fact that I'm a little bit tired because I've been, doing a lot of stuff this week, and it could be, because I was editing some images as well, and my eyes was just basically glazing over at those images that I was editing. So, and some videos and some other stuff that I was doing. I was a little bit busy. That being said, my eyes is a little bit glazed over, but when I'm looking at this image, the thing that's a little bit puzzling to me and left me speechless is because I was staring at this image for a little bit, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out where the main light was coming from. I couldn't figure it out. I think the main light is coming from camera left. I think that's where it's coming from. Now, I kind of pride myself in identifying and figuring out lighting setups when I'm reviewing images, not only my images, but other artists that I follow, and I dissect their images. And when I go to movies, I dissect that as well to figure out what lighting they have. So this is what I kind of do all the time, so I could, re-engineer that lighting setup into my own photo shoot. So, I kind of pride myself in trying to figure that out, and I think a lot of photographers as well do the same. So that being said, I kind of took a step back when I looked at this image and I really couldn't find that light source. So given that I couldn't find that light source, which is the main light in this image that's supposed to be the main influencer in this image, to me, the image just falls a little bit flat. From a lighting perspective, it just falls a little bit flat. And what I mean by that is that you don't see as much depth and dimension in this image as you should. If you have a main light source, you would immediately see where that main light source is coming from. And to the opposite of that, wherever the main light source is, the opposite of that, you will get some shadow, which will add a little bit more depth and dimension to the image, which is what I was looking for and I couldn't find in this image. So Martinez, if I'm correct about that light direction coming from camera left, let me know. I really would like to know because I've been struggling with that, trying to figure it out in this image. So another thing that I noticed in this image is in regards to the gradient, which is on camera right. Now, I'm not really sure if this gradient was added in post or if it was added while you were creating the image. So gradients could be added in a couple of fashion, or textures, if you would, could be added in a couple of fashion in camera. And I have been known to add texture or gradients to my shot when I'm trying to be a little bit more creative, like when you get the bread and butter shot and you already got all those main shots that you need to get, then you go and experiment with other things. So, I've been known to shoot through curtains to get a little bit of texture and get a little bit of color, different color and whatnot, during a getting ready session for a bride. So I don't know if that's what you did here by utilizing either maybe a side of a wall or maybe a curtain. I don't know what you used, or maybe you just added this gradient in post. Now, I'm gonna say this, the gradient for me is just a little bit distracting. It's just a little bit too prominent in the shot, and I'm not really sure it adds anything to it. So my suggestion is if you added this gradient in post, just go into post and remove it, or reduce the effect a little bit, because right now the effect is just a little bit too strong. If you created this gradient in camera, then I would say if you have any other shots where this gradient is not there, I would say use that image over this image. But if you like this image with this gradient, then you know, obviously it is your taste, you could keep it. But for me, it's just a little bit distracting. Again, that's just me. I'm really interested to hear what everyone else's opinion is on this particular subject matter, which is the lighting, because for me right now it's just a little bit of a disconnect. Like I'm not really seeing what I should be seeing, which is that main light that should be impacting the image the most. So that being said, I will move on. But overall, like I said, the lighting for this image is okay. In my opinion, it's okay. So moving on. So now let's move on to the posing in this image. So with respect to the posing, the very first thing that basically caught my attention in this image is the expression. Not necessarily the posing, the expression. Once you nail that expression, whatever the pose is, to me, doesn't really matter. The pose could be correct, it could be incorrect. It doesn't really matter. Once you nail that expression sells the entire image. So when I look at this image, that is the first thing I see. Given that I need to critique the image, I do need to identify certain things that we could have fixed if we needed to with respect to this image. But like I said, Martinez, this image, as far as expression is concerned, it does it for me. So good job with that. So if we wanted to enhance the pose a little bit, here's a couple of things that we could do. So if you notice her neck, right? Our neck have a little bit of lines in it. If you wanted to eliminate those lines, the very first thing that you would do is ask your subject to lean towards the camera a little bit. Once they lean towards the camera a little bit, it stretches out their neck and then eliminate those lines from the neck. So that would be the first thing to correct that particular issue. Again, if you wanted to, okay? So another thing that you could do with respect to this image is adding a little bit of curves to the shot. When you're working with female subjects, for the most part, what you try to do, or what I try to do, is add curves to the shot. So when I look at this image, I don't see much curves in this particular image. And the reason for that is her hands, particularly her right arm, is blocking the curves in her back. So my suggestion would be to have her raise her right arm, maybe put it something like this so she could be looking through her arm, and then you would see that curvature, you would see that curves in her back. So that would add just a little bit of interest to the shot if you would have done something like that. So other than those two changes, I don't think I would have changed much else with respect to this shot and the pose. But like I said, forgetting just those two changes that I made, her expression for the pose, for me, sold it. So I think everything else is forgiven. It's the expression that really matters. So good job with that. So now let's talk about the composition in this image. So from a compositional perspective, I think overall the composition is great. There's only one thing I would like to adjust with respect to the composition, and that is her left elbow. Right now, her left elbow is cut off just a tad. And I think if you either include all of the elbow or exclude it completely, that would help with the composition just a little bit. So when you're dealing with limbs, you always want to either include all of it or exclude it. When you cut off a piece of a limb, like feet, leg, well, not necessarily legs, but feet, hands, elbows, wrists, and stuff like that, when you cut those things off, it just appears a little bit awkward. So it's either we cut it off at a particular point where it makes the shot not so distracting, or you include it, right? So because this one is right on the edge, it just is a little bit distracting. And I don't think it would be distracting to a non-photographer, but to a photographer who's looking at this image, they definitely will look at it and be like, yeah, you probably should include that piece of the elbow. But like I said, that's very small. That's a very small thing. So it's not much of a big deal. But overall, the overall, the composition is pretty good. So great job with that. All right, guys, let's move on to image number 2. So this image was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much, James, for submitting your image. James was the second image that I critique on these Monday Critique videos. So if you go to video number 2 of the Monday Critique videos, you will see James' image, which was a pretty awesome image, by the way. So now we are going to be critiquing this image submitted by James. So let's jump into the very first thing that we always talk about, which is lighting. So from a lighting perspective, James is using what appears to be a window light, which I love window light. It's pretty awesome. It's a very, very flexible tool that you could utilize. So in this particular image, that's what he is using. So window light is very, very flattering, and I love to use window light. So awesome job with that, James. There's a couple of things that I noticed in this image with respect to the lighting that I would like to talk about. So the very first thing that I noticed is that we have some great depth and dimension in this image. So wonderful job with that, James. Because if you look on camera right, you will notice that she has some great details in the shadow area, and James is shooting on the shadow side of the face, which is the short side of the face, which is adding that depth and dimension that you would need in an image, okay? So when I look at this image, that's the first thing I notice, and awesome job with that. There is just one minor thing with respect to the lighting, and again, this is minor, and this thing you could fix very easily in post, and I'll talk about that. So when I look at this image, to me, the light on the subject is just a little bit too hot. Maybe it's one stop over. If you go into post and drop your exposure just a little bit, that will fix this problem very easily. So here's some general information with respect to shooting with digital cameras, right? So when you're shooting with digital cameras, you need to expose for the highlights. When you're shooting film, which I never shot, you generally will expose for the shadows, right? But when you're shooting with digital cameras, you expose for those highlights. And when you expose for the highlights, you will retain the details in the highlights. So what happens is if your digital camera don't have a good dynamic range, your shadows will be crushed, right? So now when you take that image, that file, and you put it into, your Lightroom or your Capture One, what you need to do there is bring up your shadows, right? And when you bring up your shadows, then you'll be able to get some of that details back into the shadows. But your camera, the camera that you're using, have to have good dynamic range in order for those details to come back. And what happens with some images as well, if your camera don't have a good dynamic range, is that when you try to bring up the shadows in post, you might start to see some noise in the shadow area. But in general, this is what you want to do, expose for those highlights. So James, with your image, I don't think you necessarily exposed for the highlights in this image. I think you probably just use like evaluative metering on this image. So my suggestion is when you're dealing with, well, when I'm shooting for the most part, I have my metering system set on spot metering. So I basically would zoom in to that particular highlight, get my exposure on that highlight, and then start shooting from there. Now, I know my shadows will be a little bit crushed, but I know my camera can pull back those details, like I can get those details back in the shadows by putting my file in post and pulling it up in there. So that's what I would suggest with respect to this image. And again, that's just a small thing, and it could be fixed in post. But I would say when you're shooting on location, that's what you would need to do to get your exposure correct and to make sure that you have a good file to work with to begin with. All right, so James, overall, I think the lighting in this image is pretty good. Great job with that. Moving on to posing. So from a posing perspective, the pose is okay. I like it. There's only a couple of things that I would change to help out with the pose. So right now, her eyes and her face is turned towards the light, the main source of light, okay? But right now, if you look at this image, her eyes appears to be a little bit strained. So there's a couple of things that you could do, and I'll talk about the other thing that I would suggest in the composition, on the composition. But as far as the posing, here's what I would suggest with respect to the posing. My suggestion here is so that our eyes don't appear as strained as it is in this shot. My suggestion is to have her turn her head just a little back towards the camera. That would help with the level of stress that you see in her eyes, okay? So that's what I would suggest there, and that's the only thing I would suggest with respect to this shot. So overall, with respect to the posing, I think you did a pretty good job here with the pose. But again, like I said, we're just dealing with just head, so there's not much to do with respect to the posing. One of the things that you did nail in this image is the expression. That little hint of a smile really brings in the viewer into this shot, and I think you did a great job with that. All right, so now let's talk about the composition in this shot. So from a compositional perspective, overall the composition is great. There's just a couple of things that I would like to change. So here's the first thing. Going back to what I was talking about with respect to the pose, I said there was two possible solutions to solve the stress level that you see in her eyes. So the first thing I talked about was either moving her face just a little bit towards the camera so that would reduce that little stress level that you see in her eyes. Now the second solution, which is under the composition, is simply to move your camera position to camera left just a little bit so that her eyes don't appear to be so strained. So that would be the second solution that I would suggest to eliminate that stress level in her eyes. Now, there's another thing that I wanted to mention on the posing, but I think it's probably more appropriate to mention it under composition, and that is her dress strap. Right now, her dress strap is just coming out of her chin. So the one thing I would suggest here is if you change your camera position, then that camera position change, which is to camera left, will help eliminate that strap coming out of her chin. So those are the two changes that I would suggest with respect to your composition, which pretty much fixes two problems, right? Which is her stress level in her eyes and the dress strap. By simply moving to camera left, I think that would help eliminate those two problems for you. But overall, I think I like the composition, so awesome job. So now let's get on to the rating of these two images. Light. I gave this image a 3. Pose. I gave this image a 4. Composition. I gave this image a 4. This image received an overall rating of 3.66 out of 5. Now let's move on to image number 2. Light. I gave this image a 3. Pose. I gave this image a 3. Composition. I gave this image a 4. Overall, this image received a rating of 3.33. Thank you very much, guys, for submitting your images. I sincerely appreciate you guys submitting your images for me to critique. I hope you got a lot of value out of it, and I hope the viewers also got a lot of information from what I said today. These images are becoming tougher and tougher, and I'm just enjoying it more and more. So thank you once again. That is it. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with your friends and family. And please put some feedback down below and let me know what you think about this video. And guys, if you got this far in the video, you must be enjoying this content and you must be enjoying this channel. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next Monday.